Chapter 36. This venerable one has probably lost his mind. Without thinking, Chuaning reached out to steady Moran. As the two of them stood plastered against each other in the warm spring water, Moran felt a spark run through his entire body as goosebumps crawled up his skin. Even though he'd already held a near-naked Chuaning in the Red Lotus Pavilion, the circumstances at the time had been dire. There had been no time to dwell on the situation, so he hadn't thought much of it. Now, with one hand against Chuaning's chest and the other unconsciously supporting his shizun's waist, their legs tangled together under the water, and with the spring making the skin feel warmer and more slippery, Moran's head all but exploded. Upon making contact with Chuaning, even though he'd done nothing but touch his waist, his body reacted to the intensity of a rushing river. Shizun, Moran frantically tried to get up and away, and in the struggle, his red-hot lower parts made contact with the other man. Chuaning's eyes widened, his beautiful face stricken with horror, and he rapidly backed away. At the same time, the droplet of water that had been clinging to his eyelashes slid into his eye. He grew more and more agitated, squeezing his eyes shut and rubbing at them, but he didn't have a bath towel with which to wipe away the water. Shizun, use mine. Moran's face burned red, mortified to absolute death. Still trying his best to pretend that nothing was wrong, he used his own towel to wipe the water droplets off of Chuaning's face. When Chuaning finally opened his phoenix eyes again, he still had a baffled look of distress, under which lay a hint of panic. It only lasted a moment before he quickly forced himself to calm down. He pretended he hadn't felt anything at all. "The fragrance bar," he said tightly. "Pass it to me." "Oh, okay." Moran crab-walked stiffly to the edge of the pool and picked up the box of fragrance bars sitting on the edge. "What scent does Shizun want?" "Whichever." Moran's head swam in a daze. After staring blankly into the box for a long time, he turned back and said with complete sincerity, "There's no scent here called whichever." Chuaning sighed heavily. "Plum blossom and high tongue." "Okay." Moran took 2 fragrance bars and handed them to Chuaning. As soon as their fingertips touched, Moran experienced another burst of tremors. No matter how badly he wanted to shake off all those memories from the past, it was impossible. If this had been the past, he would already be fervently entwined with Chuaning beside the spring. A vision appeared unbidden before his eyes, of Chuaning half kneeling, sprawled on the ground beneath Moran's fiery, ferocious passion. His shizun's eyes were half-lidded, and his body trembled uncontrollably as he endured, but was still fucked into his own climax. Moran was unable to stand it anymore. These carnal desires made his eyes go bloodshot. He didn't dare look at Chuaning at all. Even looking at Shimei was safer than looking at him. How could this be? How could this happen? Moran quickly finished washing himself and, taking advantage of the fact that the other 3 were still soaking, said something vague to the effect of, "I'm sleepy and will turn in first." Once Moran got back to his room, he bolted and locked the door. He couldn't take it anymore. He moved to relieve himself of his urges. He didn't want to think about Chuaning's appearance at a time like this. He even preferred the idea of soiling Shimei's pure image. At least, that would be easier for his confused heart to accept. But neither his body nor his mind would listen, and every sight that flashed before his eyes was that of the past him and Chuaning bound together in passion. It was like this night had unlocked floodgates, and every single torrid memory rushed back into his mind in a frenzy, racking him with devastating shudders. Moran treated himself almost roughly, as though he was on top of the other man's body and on the verge of ruin. He threw his head back, refusing to accept it, yet his breath came out in muddled gasps and pants. He breathed out a name without realizing it. "Warning." As he called this name, he let out a stifled grunt, shivering slightly as he came without holding anything back, covering his palm in sticky wetness. Once he'd finished, Moran leaned over to rest his forehead against the cold wall. His eyes were awash with confusion, shame, guilt, loathing, arousal. He had never expected he would have such a strong reaction to Chuaning even after being reborn. Moran was instantly filled with disgust toward himself. In his past life, he had never attained Shimei and had vented all his passion into countless other frivolous relationships. Though he had made those relationships seem like passionate love, none of them had really meant anything to him. With the candlelight extinguished, it was all just sex, all the same, no matter who it was with. Even the way his heart had moved toward Rongju had been because of the man's passing resemblance to Shimei. But the kinds of feelings he'd had toward Chuaning had been completely different. He was acutely aware of how much more intense everything had been with Chuaning. Just thinking about him like that had brought Moran a pleasure more profound than anything he had ever felt with a prostitute. It hadn't been just physical, it had been... Moran didn't want to continue that line of thought. He was in love with Shimei, always had been and always would be. His feelings absolutely wouldn't change. After repeating this to himself a few times, Moran calmly slowed his breathing, frowned, and squeezed his eyes shut. He felt anxious, annoyed, and aggrieved all at once. He didn't want this. When it came to lust, he couldn't help but think of Chuaning. When the lust subsided, he didn't want anything to do with Chuaning, didn't want to imagine so much as a hair on his bed, not even a fleeting look. Frantically, he thought to himself, almost to the point of paranoia, that the only one he liked, the one he loved deeply, was Shimei. Chuaning's mind was in a similar state of distress. Totally unexpectedly, he had seen and, moreover, felt Moran's desire. The young man's body was quite mature in that regard and was already profoundly overwhelming, so hard and so hot as to be scalding once excited, like hot iron waiting to be forged. Even though Chuaning had quickly molded his face into a blank slate of serenity and refused to bring anything up afterward, the encounter had made his head go numb and filled him with disbelief. To make matters worse, his own body had reacted as well. Fortunately, his thin face meant he always wore a bathrobe, even in hot spring. It covered his whole body, and so no one had seen a thing. Otherwise, he really wouldn't have been able to show his face again. But why would Moran? As he lay in bed that night, Chuaning ruminated quietly for hours. He dared not even imagine that, maybe, Moran also liked him. That sort of thought was entirely too delusional and shameful. Even the cautious thought of, maybe Moran also likes. Chuaning furiously pinched himself before he could even finish the thought, before the word me could surface in his mind. That pair of clear, bright phoenix eyes flickered as if trying to hide. He didn't dare entertain the whole thought. Besides, his personality was harsh. He was quick to hit people, his words were venomous, he had a bad temper, and he was nowhere near as attractive as Shimei. And, on top of all that, he was no longer young. Even if Moran liked men, he wouldn't be blind enough to like Chuaning. To all appearances, Chuaning was aloof and haughty, but within, in truth, he had been treated coldly by others for so long, been feared for so long, that as he walked this long and lonely road, his opinion of himself had slowly crumbled to dust. After they woke the next day, Moran and Chuaning met in the hallway of the inn, both harboring secrets in their hearts. They looked at each other, but neither deigned to speak first. Ultimately, it was Moran who carried on as if all was normal. He smiled at Chuaning. "Shizun." Chuaning was relieved, as he really hadn't known how else to deal with this situation. But as Moran had chosen not to mention anything that had happened the night before, he was perfectly content to go along with it. He nodded once, lightly. "Since you're up, go wake Shimei as well. Let's pack and depart for Dawning Peak." Dawning Peak was covered in snow all year round and exceedingly cold. Even for a cultivator, it was difficult to withstand such frigid weather. Chuaning went to a tailor to buy winter cloaks, and gloves for his disciples to wear when it got particularly freezing. The shopkeeper, smoking from her pipe with her scarlet lips as she smiled and welcomed customers, took one look at Moran and said, "What a handsome little Tianjun! Look at this black cape with a golden dragon on it. The embroidery is of the highest quality. The eyes alone took me more than 3 months to complete." Moran gave her an embarrassed laugh. "Chichi's words are very sweet, but I'm just going into the mountains to seek a weapon. There's no need for me to wear something so ornate and formal." When this prospect failed, the shopkeeper instead took hold of Shimei. "Ooh, this young Tianjun is lovely beyond compare, even more so than the most gorgeous girl in the city. Tianjun, I think this red butterfly and peony cloak would suit you perfectly. How about you give it a try?" Shimei forced a smile. "Ma'am, isn't this a woman's cloak?" Shu Meng hated shopping for clothes, so he'd refused to come along and was waiting outside. Chuaning chose a black cloak with purple trim for him, with white rabbit fur that lined the hood. "Tianjun, this cloak is a bit small for you," said the shopkeeper. "It would be better suited for a teenager." "It's for my disciple," Chuaning said tonelessly. "Oh." The shopkeeper realized her mistake and quickly smiled. "What a wonderful teacher." It might have been the first time Chuaning had been called a wonderful teacher. He went still, and his face betrayed nothing, but his steps were out of sync when he walked away, right arm moving with his right leg, and so on for quite a few steps. Moran ended up choosing an ashen-colored cloak, Shimei a moonlight white one, and Chuaning a plain white one, as well as the black cloak with purple trim. After they made their purchases, they went back to Shu Meng. When Shu Meng saw his cloak, his eyes widened. "What is it?" Chuaning asked, not understanding his reaction. "It's nothing." When Chuaning walked far enough away that Shu Meng thought he couldn't hear, he looked at the trim on the cloak and muttered, "Purple? I don't like purple." He didn't expect to hear Chuaning's voice say sharply, "Such nonsense. If you won't wear it, you can climb up naked." Chu Meng fell silent. They went at a leisurely pace for the last leg of their journey, and before nightfall, they reached the foot of Dawning Peak. The mountain was rich in spiritual power and home to many beasts and monsters. Even cultivators didn't dare rush up it carelessly unless they were significantly strong. However, since Chuaning was with them, they didn't have to worry about such things. Chuaning conjured 3 night-glow haitang blossoms from thin air, gave them spirit-repelling properties, and tucked them into the belts of his 3 disciples. "Let's go," he said. Moran raised his head to look out at the peaks concealed under the veil of night, like a huge ancient beast crouching deathly still. Myriad emotions poured into his heart. In the past, it had been on Dawning Peak that he'd declared to the sun and moon, to ghosts and demons, that he, Moran, was no longer satisfied with being Taxianjun of the cultivation realm, and that he was going to declare himself emperor of the entire world. That same year, he had taken a wife and concubine at Dawning Peak. He still remembered the face of that wife, Song Chutong, a true, unparalleled beauty. From certain angles, her features had strongly resembled Shimei's. Moran wasn't a person who cared much for etiquette or honor, and he hadn't been bothered with the tedium of marriage rites. Instead, he had taken Song Chutong's fine hand and pulled the red-veiled woman up a flight of thousands of stairs. Together, they had walked for over an hour. Eventually, Song Chutong's feet had hurt too much to go on. Moran had a bad temper and had lifted her veil, intending to yell at her. But under the light of the moon, Song Chutong's delicate eyes and her wounded yet resilient gaze had made her look just like a certain person, one who had long since passed. Those scathing words had died on Moran's tongue, and, after drawing a shaky breath, the words that had finally emerged were, "Shimei, I'll carry you." In terms of seniority, if Song Chutong had been his peer, she would indeed have been his Shimei, so she had only paused slightly at this term of address, reasoning that since Moran had wiped out the entirety of Rufeng's sect, she was naturally now part of Xisheng Peak. That being the case, it wasn't like it was incorrect for him to call her Shimei, so she'd only smiled and said, "Okay." And so, for the last several thousand steps, Taxianjun, master of the mortal realm and lord of the shadows, had steadily, one foot in front of the other, carried his red-adorned bride to the peak. There, he lowered his head and watched the shape of their shadows twist strangely over the ground and overlap each other. He laughed a little, voice hoarse as he said, "Shimei, I am going to be the master of the mortal realm. From this day onward, no one will be able to hurt you." The woman on his back didn't know what to say to this. She hesitated a little and finally said, "Mm-hmm." The voice was soft, perhaps because it was so soft. Its femininity was difficult to distinguish, and it sounded muffled and ambiguous. Not a soul could see Moran's face as his eyes grew red. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I've made you wait for this day far too long." Song Chutong thought that Moran was saying that he'd had feelings for her for a long time, so she replied gently, "My husband?" This time, the undeniably feminine voice came out clear and crisp, like morning dew, pleasing to the ear, but Moran's feet jerked to a halt. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." As he started to walk again, Moran's voice lost its hoarse quality and no longer trembled. After a pause, he said, "Just call me Aran from now on." Song Chutong was caught off guard and didn't dare to address Ta Jianjun in this way. "My husband, that I'm afraid." "If you don't listen to me, I'll throw you off of this mountain." Moran snarled, violent and severe. "Aran!" Song Chutong quickly amended her words. "Aran, I was wrong." Moran said nothing else. He lowered his head again, silently walking forward. The shadows on the ground were still only shadows. In hindsight, it was easy to see that was all they had ever been. The things he had yearned for were nothing more than fantasies. What he had was nothing more than an illusion. In the end, it was all just wishful thinking. "Shimei." "Hmm?" The person walking beside Moran turned his head. Amidst the sounds of shifting leaves and rustling grass, the light of the moon illuminated that person's lovely face. "Aran, what is it?" "Are you tired from walking?" Moran glanced at Chuaning and Chuomeng, who were walking in front of them, and whispered, "If you're tired, how about I carry you?" Before Shimei could reply, Chuaning turned his head to look back at them. He glared dourly at Moran. "Are Shi Mingjing's legs broken? Does he need you to carry him?" "Shizun," Shimei said hurriedly. "Aran was just joking. Don't be angry." Chuaning frowned, eyebrows drawn together into a severe expression. Sparks practically flew from his glower. "Ridiculous. What could I possibly be angry about?" Done speaking, he whirled back around with a flick of his sleeve. Moran and Shimei exchanged a look. "Shizun seems mad." "You know how he is," Moran whispered into Shimei's ear. "Super petty. He's all cold-blooded and heartless, and he won't even let other people be nice to each other." He wrinkled his nose and lowered his voice even further, concluding, "He's seriously the worst." Suddenly, Chuaning's voice rang out from in front of them. "Mo you, one more word and I'll toss you down this mountain." Moran shut his mouth obediently, but he secretly grinned over at Shimei and mouthed, "See? What did I say?"